Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us today. During these uncertain and sometimes scary times, it is important to reassess protection plans and policies that you have in place to protect you from the unexpected. We thought it was important to address some of these items and have brought in a guest speaker who will focus on estate planning concerns and educate us on hot topics she is seeing with her clients. We are very excited to have estate planning attorney Natasha Carroll-Ferrary with us today and sharing her expertise. But before she starts, we want to run through some of these pieces, some of the pieces you need to protect your family and financial plan. I need to read a quick disclaimer before I hand this over to Eva, so hang in there. The information that we are sharing is for general information purposes only and is not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individuals. To determine which course of action may be appropriate for you, always contact your financial advisor. All right, Eva, I'll hand it over to you.
So we're often asked by a lot of our clients what the proper insurance coverage is. Do I have too much? Do I need more? And so we thought it would be very helpful to kind of dive into the generic guidelines that we need in order to have that proper coverage. So in looking and thinking about insurance, it's very crucial that we, first of all, protect all the assets that we do have, protect ourselves, and also protect our family from any kind of loss that could occur. So what we're looking at here is establishing a kind of overarching umbrella of protection. Now, what that includes is disability insurance, health insurance, home insurance, auto insurance, life insurance, and then finally a trust as well. Now, when you have all of these elements in place, you're able to, first of all, again, protect your family and the assets that you do have from any specific loss. Now, I'm going to get into disability insurance first and foremost and kind of how this works overall. So disability insurance can be used to cover any loss from disability up to 50 to 60% of your previous income. Now, in California, you have the weekly ability to get up to $1,300 per week in disability coverage as well. Now, the disability insurance that you do get is received income tax free, so a major benefit there. And depending on what kind of industry you're in, it could, if it's a very hands-on industry, if it's very manual or labor intensive, it could definitely be a benefit to having disability insurance. In addition to that, diving into health insurance a little bit and the ways that works as well. So first and foremost, we're going to want to cover your deductible. What your deductible is how much you have to pay out of pocket before you get into co-insurance. And what co-insurance
Sorry, Ellen, I think we need to go through 2 slides. Yeah, the next one. Sorry, just so everyone's on the same page.
Great. So after this big deductible is met, your co-insurance starts to kick in. Co-insurance is a split between the insurer, your insurance company, and yourself. So typically an 80 to 20 split. And when you have a higher deductible and a higher out-of-pocket maximum that you need to hit, this will result in a lower premium payment. So for someone like myself, my insurance policy might have a higher deductible because I don't find myself going to the doctor that often. But again, this needs to be tailored to each individual and what's financially viable to them, and working with a planner to kind of establish that a little bit more. In addition to that, co-pays, for example, don't count towards your deductible, so something to take into account there. And I'll pass this over to Francine.
Next slide, please, Ellen. So Eva talked about medical health insurance coverages. What I want to focus on a little bit is liability and property insurance, and specifically home insurance and car insurance. First, going into home insurance, you want to make sure, if you own a home, and there's also renter's insurance if you are just renting right now, but still makes sense to look at your overall coverage. If you do own a home, you want to make sure that Section 1 that covers dwelling, 80% of the replacement cost is what you should be insured for. So for example, it's not the fair market value of the house. So if I buy a house in Santa Monica and I pay $1 million, I don't need my home to be insured for $1 million because it doesn't cost me $1 million to build a home. right? It may only cost me 500,000 for the actual structure. So based on the 500,000, I need 80% of that coverage for me to be fully insured. And so that would be 400,000 in coverage, right? So making sure that your dwelling is properly insured, or else you will be on the hook if something catastrophic happens to your home, which is something we never planned for, but want to make sure we have enough coverage. The second item for home insurance is making sure that you do have enough personal property insurance. So some people have a lot of antiques, collectibles, jewelry that they have that's very valuable in their house. So you want to make sure that your coverage will be sufficient to at least, try to recover or recoup some of that in the event that it gets stolen, or, like I said, the house burns down and you need to be able to replace those valuable items. This third item is very, very important, and I recommend everyone to look into it, but it is an umbrella policy that we all might have heard of and not really fully understood what it means. But it is additional coverage that you can get in case of, injuries that happen on your property. So if someone comes and they fall and slip and then they sue you, the umbrella insurance will kick in there. Or, if my dog runs out and bites my neighbor and that person sues me or has a lot of medical expenses, my umbrella insurance will cover that. It's not that expensive, and it makes sense to look into your current home insurance policies to see what the additional coverage would be. But mine, for example, I have a $2 million umbrella policy that's an extra $50 per month. And it might be a little discounted because I have my car insurance through State Farm, my home insurance through State Farm, and also the umbrella policy. So worth looking into. You can get $1 million in coverage or more, depending on your situation. And then with car insurance, this was probably a lot more applicable when we were driving a lot more pre-COVID, but we'll all get there eventually. So it is important to talk about now and look at your insurance. But two main factors: looking at your BIPD, so your bodily injury and property damage insurance, just to see how much coverage you have. So for my personal policy, I'm covered $250,000 per person, up to a total accident coverage amount of $500,000. So $250,000 for bodily injury insurance and $500,000 for one accident. And I got in a car accident a few years ago, which forced me to relook at my insurance and make additional increases just in case. But important to do so, because we know that medical expenses can rack up, can get really expensive. So you want to make sure that you have adequate coverage. And I increased also my property damage from $50,000 to $100,000 because living in LA, I could easily hit a car that's worth $75,000, and if my property damage only covers $50,000, I'll be on the hook for the rest. Right? So I increased that, which is actually only the middle tier of the options that I was able to choose from, but comfortable with. And to offset the increase in premiums for my additional coverage, I just increased my deductible from $750 to $1,000, and that's something that I was personally okay with, because I always have some money in my emergency bank account to cover for the things that I don't account for, and $1,000 would be okay that I could stomach to be able to afford getting more coverage, to be able to limit my stop loss of how much money that could come out of my pocket. So that's just a few personal insurance examples that I have for you guys. And then Kaytlin, I think you're going to dive into the life insurance, which is also part of the planning process.
Yes, please. So Alan, if you could put the life insurance slide up. Perfect. Okay. So a question that we get a lot is like, how much life insurance do you actually need? And this really depends on the individual. There's no cookie cutter plan for what the number of insurance you need versus somebody else. But this is a formula that we use all the time. And it's based off of first, how many children you have. So I have one son. So just based off of that, I need at least $250,000 for the protection of my son. $250,000 is how much on average it costs to raise a child from 0 to 18. So this does not include, college or anything other than that. This is just to raise the child from 0 to 18. So, the more kids you have, the more insurance you're going to need. We do individual income times 4. So that means if something happens to me, my husband would still have my income, per se for 4 years. That way he doesn't have to change his lifestyle. Things can kind of stay the same because he still has my income coming in. And then the third option is, or the third part of the formula is major liabilities. So this would be, you have a mortgage, if you have like private student loans, credit card debt, same sort of thing. So, if something happened to me and I have a mortgage, if I have the insurance coverage for my mortgage, again, my husband doesn't have to move out of the house. He doesn't have to change his lifestyle just because something happens to me. So this number will change, obviously, depending on who you are, and it's important to reevaluate this number. But this is a formula that we use to figure out, what's your ideal number for life insurance coverage. So that's our life insurance. And I'm now going to introduce Natasha again, who's going to jump in and talk about the estate planning sides. But Natasha is an attorney in Los Angeles. She focuses her practice on designing comprehensive estate plans for her clients with particular attention to their specific needs and family dynamics. Natasha began her career as a federal law clerk in West Virginia, then worked in private practice as a litigation attorney prior to joining the law firm where she's at now. We are excited to have Natasha join us today, and we know you will learn a lot from it. So I will let her take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I want to start by saying that estate planning is definitely a topic that most people don't like to think about, but it's really, really important to do some planning while you're able to do that, especially to protect your family. I want to start by defining what exactly we're talking about. When you saw estate planning was one of the topics today, you probably knew that I would talk about death. And you're right. But I also want to spend some time talking about another aspect of estate planning, one that most of you probably haven't thought about yet, and that's incapacity. It's so much lighter, I promise. Incapacity is essentially when you can't make decisions for yourself and you need somebody else to make decisions for you. Most people think of incapacity as somebody who is in a coma or has Alzheimer's. Someone in those circumstances would need someone else to handle everything involving their day-to-day affairs on a long-term basis. And that's one version of incapacity. But incapacity really is a spectrum. There's that long-term incapacity like a coma or Alzheimer's, but there's also temporary incapacity. One example of temporary incapacity is if you're under anesthesia. When you're under anesthesia, you can't call your employer. You can't call your bank. You can't draw down your IRA. You would need somebody to do that for you. If you're in a car accident, like Francine just mentioned, hopefully you do walk away. But if you don't, you might be in the hospital for a day or a week or more. And during that time, you can't handle your finances, and you may even need somebody to make medical decisions for you. Right now, and I really hope this isn't news to anyone, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So if you're in the hospital now, people are really limited in who can come see you, and your access to the outside world is really limited. You might be okay to decide what to eat and what to wear, but you may not be able to handle your own financial affairs. If you were in the hospital and intubated in this last week, you would have needed someone to file taxes on your behalf. So those are some examples of temporary incapacity that we're seeing in real life right now. Before COVID, if someone were incapacitated and had done nothing in advance, their loved ones would have to go to court to get the right to be able to make decisions on their behalf. And that's even for married people. So spouses can't make financial or medical decisions on behalf of their spouse just by being married. Marriage doesn't exempt you from this. I can't emphasize that enough. There's a misconception that spouses can do these things on behalf of one another, and they cannot unless there is steps taken in advance or you get a court order. So now imagine your spouse is in the hospital during a global pandemic. Your spouse hadn't done anything in advance, and now you've got to go to court. And right now, under COVID, not all courts are open. There are time delays, and it's really, really hard emotionally and physically. So there's a better way, but it does require planning. How can you avoid having a loved one go to court? There are two general tools, and that is a power of attorney, which deals with managing your financial decisions, and what's called a living will, or a healthcare power of attorney. You or your spouse can use these documents in advance to tell people who can handle your affairs for you. And this avoids anybody having to go to court to get the right to be able to do this. It's really important to do that while you can make these decisions. There's another type of incapacity that I want to talk about, and that is if you are under 18 years old. If you're under 18, you are a minor and you can't make decisions for yourself. A minor child cannot sign contracts, cannot own property, and must have a guardian in the circumstances that they lose their parents. This is one of the most challenging decisions a parent can make. Who are they going to nominate to become the guardian of their children if they're not around? It's so easy to avoid making this decision. It's really, really tough. But without nominating a guardian, your child's loved ones would have to go to court to be appointed guardians. It can be really arduous for both your child and for the loved one who is seeking to become the legal guardian. In our office, we do guardian nominations in a will. So the key with incapacity really is to make sure that you make these decisions before you get a diagnosis, before you're hospitalized, while you can. You can't know in advance when you're going to be faced with these situations. I touched on minor children, and I actually want to touch really quickly on children who are over 18. If you have children who are over 18 years old, then you don't have the right to make decisions on behalf of your child unless they have a power of attorney, a living will, or you get a court order. This is one of those misconceptions that, you know, because it's your child and it's always your child, that you can do these on behalf of your child. The same thing with spouses, you cannot do it for your child. And I also want to emphasize that it is your child who needs to make the decisions of who can make the decisions on their behalf. So, for example, if your child retains an attorney to draft a power of attorney, they may or may not select you to make those decisions on their behalf. That is up to them once they're 18 years old. So that is covering your incapacity and a little bit about your over 18 child. The other aspect I promised to talk about is death. As we know, we all will eventually die. If someone dies without having done anything in advance, then their estate goes through probate court. The first question I usually get is, what is an estate? It's a fancy legal word for a legal concept that owns everything that you owned the second before you died. Regardless of how much or how little you have, that is your estate. And whatever is in your estate goes through probate court. Probate court is tasked with getting property out of a dead person's name and into the name of the living heirs. To do that, the court needs to give people notice, like creditors. They need to resolve any disputes. They need to identify heirs. It's a really long process, and it's very expensive, and it's a public proceeding. And I want to emphasize that family members are grieving through all of this. In terms of the length of time, the process generally takes about 18 to 24 months, and that's in a pre-COVID world. If you have little kids, that's a really, really long time. And if you have any loved one, that's just generally a long time. The cost of probate is a percentage of your gross estate. I really want to emphasize that it's your gross estate, because a lot of times people think that if they have a mortgage that they don't really own the value of your house, but that's not the case for the purpose of assessing your gross estate for probate costs. To give an example, if you have $1 million in gross assets, then the attorney who takes your estate through probate court is entitled to $23,000. The person who serves as the executor is also entitled to $23,000. Usually the executor is a loved one who declines that, but you're talking about either $23,000 or even $46,000 for $1 million in gross assets. So that's a lot of money. It's a lot of time. And how do you avoid all that? That's where the trust comes in. You can create a living trust which changes title to your assets before you die, meaning that we have done all the work in advance for the probate court. A trust acts like a treasure chest while you're alive. You can put everything in the name of the trust and go about your regular life. You put your bank accounts in the name of the trust. You can buy your home in the name of the trust. If you already own a home, you can transfer it into the name of the trust. And it essentially makes everything much easier at the end of your life because your family avoids any cost and time and the public nature of a proceeding. It requires a lot of planning, but it does really help protect your family. I know this is a lot of information, so I certainly invite anyone to ask me questions and talk to me. I do complimentary consultations, and I'm always happy to set up a video call to talk about any specific situations that you'd like to discuss. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kaytlin.
Great. Francine, I think you have a few questions,
I do.
right, for Natasha?
Yeah, so we have
Sure.
clients ask us some general questions that I think would be helpful for them if you could answer them. And you might have briefly talked about it, but
Sure.
what is the difference between a will and a trust?
Sure. I sort of hinted at. Yeah. So the simple answer is that the will goes through probate and a trust does not. The will gives someone something at the time of death only, but the trust is a structure that allows more flexibility. So a trust can be used during the time of incapacity to manage finances. It can also be used when somebody is not incapacitated, but just doesn't want to manage their own finances anymore. In terms of flexibility, you can do things in a trust, like leave things in trust for a child's benefit so that they never actually own the property. If they don't own it, then creditors can't come after it. So if a child gets married and then gets divorced, a former spouse can't access that trust because it's not in their name. It's kind of a type of asset protection that you can give to somebody else that they can't get for themselves. To answer the second part of your question, in a comprehensive estate plan, you would do both a trust and a will. And what the will functions in that circumstance, it does three things. The first thing is that it revokes any prior wills. The second thing is it names any guardians. And the third thing is that it pours everything into the trust so that it's extremely clear your intention for everything to go through the trust.
Great. Thank you. And
You're
then,
welcome.
we talked a lot about assets and protect your assets. For a client that comes to us that may just be starting or they don't have a ton of assets, when would you recommend getting a will or a trust established, or both?
Sure. To me, it's actually less about what you have and more about establishing a structure so that you have a plan in place for both incapacity and death. And sometimes it's more so incapacity, like all the examples that I gave. You may not think that you have a lot of assets now, but things increase in value, and you want to make sure that something is in place for that period of time. Once you have a trust in place, it's there forever if you want it to be. While you're alive, you can change the terms of your trust, but you've really done all the hard work of creating it. Realistically, I strongly recommend a trust for anyone who has children, especially young children, or anyone who owns real estate in California. And the reason why it has to do with the probate issues that we talked about earlier, that it takes 18 to 24 months, and that it's based on your gross assets. Once you own a house in California, you're teetering on $1 million of assets or more, and that's the $23,000 or $46,000 in fees at a minimum. So I hope that helps answer. Basically, everyone should at least engage in a conversation about whether or not it makes sense.
Yeah, and it seems like it makes sense just to get it done once because it'll stay with you, and then just reviewing it over time. So then my last question for you is, how often would you recommend a client review their trust and update their trust, make amendments, and so forth?
Sure. Once a trust is established, I generally recommend reviewing it every 3 to 5 years. The reason for that is that laws change and people's priorities change. So you want to make sure that it's not just that the trust is still applicable, but also that the people who you designated to do certain things are still the people you would want to do it. Are they still alive? Are they still the people you would trust the most to do it? I actually do complimentary trust reviews to make sure that a trust still does what somebody wants it to do, and that it is still what, that it still involves the people who you've designated that you want to do things for you are the right fit.
Awesome. That's great. A lot of information, but good information. Information we all need to think about. May not be the happiest subject to talk about, but it protects your family. And at the end of the day, that's what is important. Yeah. So thank you. And I don't know if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to email us and we can send it over to Natasha, or you can email her directly. Otherwise, we hope you learned a lot, and we'll get something on board for our next topic, and we'll hope to see you guys soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.